Assalamu alaikum, ahlan wa sahlan, hello and welcome to Literary Conversations Across Borders. Thank you so much for being here. What a series this is. We have had so many wonderful subjects to talk about. We've had science, we've had religion, we've had the environment, we've had global politics, we've had poetry. And today's session, I think, has the potential to encompass so many of those different things. We are talking journalism today, and I do hope that our two wonderful panelists will agree that there is at least some poetry within the words that they write for their publications. My name is Julia Wheeler. Let me please introduce those two panelists. Christina Lamb is the Chief Foreign Correspondent for the UK's Sunday Times newspaper. For more than 30 years, she's reported from some of the most troubled places in the world, and the stories she's told us from them have won her many accolades, including Foreign Correspondent of the Year 5 times. She's written 9 books. Her latest is the compelling and harrowing Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. Sultan Sooud al-Qassemi is an Emirati columnist and researcher on society, politics and culture in the Gulf. He's written for the Financial Times, The Guardian, the New York Times, and The National, among others. He made news himself during the Arab Spring when his tweets became important sources, and Time magazine later listed his Twitter feed in their 140 best feeds. Sultan is the founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation, and some of you may well be enjoying his digital cultural Majlis series during the lockdown. Welcome, Christina. Welcome, Sultan, to Literary Conversations Across Borders. Thanks so much for being here. Christina, let me begin with you, if I may. You've been reporting now for 33 years. I wonder whether you can take us back to the time when you started to give us an idea, really, of how both the media landscape has changed in that time, but also the news gathering operation.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining us. Well, 33 years, that makes me sound very old. So I have to just say I was very young when I started. But things have changed enormously in that time, some in a good way and some in a bad way. So when I started, I would say, and I started out reporting from Afghanistan when the Soviet Union had occupied it. And it was really, really difficult getting my reports out. Communications were extremely difficult. Logistics, I would say, was almost 90% of my job. And I could not file from Afghanistan. I used to have to go back to Pakistan. Then there was no internet, no mobile phones. In fact, sometimes I look back and think, how did we do the job? And the only way to send my copy back to newspapers, I was working for the Financial Times, at Time magazine, among others, was either to dictate my copy to a copy taker or to go to a telex office. Many of our viewers may not even remember what a telex office is. And often a certain sort of facilitation fee had to be paid. And even phoning, there was no direct dial from Pakistan then. So you had to go through an international operator, which took ages. And I remember that I was there the night that General Zia was killed in this mysterious air crash. And I was one of the very few foreign journalists in the country. And it was this huge story. It was my first really big story. And I was dialing on these old rotary phones over and over again to try and get the international operator, and I just could not get through. And I was almost in tears because I had this big story and I couldn't get, I think it took me an hour finally to get the operator, who then put the call through to London, and they were very relieved to hear from me. And we kept the line open. So all of that's changed enormously, because now you can send stories from anywhere, you know, from the middle of the desert in Iraq, from the top of a mountain in the Hindu Kush, which is a good thing, but sometimes not a good thing, because it means you have less time to think about things. And then in terms of things that have changed not such a good way, it's become more dangerous. I think journalists have become targets in a way that we weren't then. If something happened to us covering that war, it was more that we had done something silly or we were very unlucky. but nobody was actually trying to kill journalists specifically. That is a very sad way that things have changed. And of course, the other massive change is social media and its huge amount of information, sort of chaos of information that is out there, and the fact that sort of anybody could really operate as a journalist and put out information.
I guess one thing that hasn't changed is that you need to be in the right place at the right time, and you were, weren't you?
Yes, I mean, I was as I said, I started out in Afghanistan, then covering Pakistan as well, and I was there when General Zia died, and then Benazir Bhutto, who I had got to know, became Prime Minister, and it was a really fascinating time to be in Pakistan. So yeah, I mean, you can be the best journalist in the world, but if you're not in a place where anything's happening, then that's not much use to anybody. And a lot of that is luck, I think, actually.
Sultan, one of the things that has changed is that the people who are consuming the news that you and Christina write, or the comment that you and Christina write, have far more choices now, don't they? There's a lot more choice, and it's a click away.
That's correct. Thank you for having me here. I grew up reading regular newspapers. I'm sure I've read Christina Lamb's wonderful columns back then. But also, I consume radio news. I consume television news. But now you can get news online. It's been the case for the past 10 years. You can get video news and radio news online, and you can get it on demand. So it isn't just the matter of having the variety of the news, but also it's whenever you want the news. And I feel like less and less people are looking at newspapers for the news, and maybe they're looking for insight and analysis rather than breaking news. I can't think of too many people who are reading the newspapers for that reason. But certainly you can get news about the Middle East from South Asian newspapers and Western European newspapers and North American newspapers. So it's no longer the case of getting news from the Middle East, on the Middle East from the Middle East alone.
And you describe yourself as a commentator and a columnist rather than a journalist.
Well, I was never a journalist, but I was a commentator. I feel like I still am in a way, but I was more. I sort of was thrown into this field. I started translating, or started just writing whatever Middle Eastern leaders were saying and translating it into English. And suddenly that became useful for journalists. And it was a service that didn't really exist then. A lot of journalists were depending on tidbits and snippets of Middle Eastern leaders. A 1-hour speech could have been summarized in 3 or 4 lines, but sometimes there is, there's actually news in what hasn't been translated. There is even in some of the quirkiness and some of the quirky leaders we had, like Gaddafi, for example, some of the weird things that they said were actually in a way interesting because they show you character. And this was something that was never picked up in the mainstream media. And people found it through, I suppose, some of my Twitter feeds, and many others I'm sure did so much better than I. But this helped you build a character. This helped you build an understanding of that individual who is leading a country of 10, 20, 30 million people.
So you became famous for that during the Arab Spring. I wonder whether you feel actually that it was partly activism on your part, because you are choosing things to translate, and therefore there's a potential for an agenda there.
I certainly, if you think of someone like me, I certainly, and I feel like this is going to be quoted one day back at me, but I feel like, of course, I had a, what's the word? I had sort of a, I don't know how to say this, but I wanted these young men and women to succeed. I wanted them to have a better future. I wanted them, I still do, of course. And so of course, I was selective with what I was translating. I wasn't selective with what was being said, but I was selective with who I wanted to translate, partly because I was interested in this individual, but also because I am from this region. I'm interested in the future of this region, I wasn't translating, for example, cooking shows. Not that I don't enjoy food. I probably do enjoy food more than politics, but this is something that I felt was a factor that could change history. You felt it in 2010 and 11 and 12. You felt that history was in the making, and I couldn't get myself out of that. So it was easy to walk in, but walking out, it was so difficult. It took me years to sort of not turn my back, but at least retreat from that world.
So in some ways, I wonder whether it became addictive, because you've been quoted as saying that actually you were translating and tweeting once every 45 seconds at some time. And also once when you were at a wedding, you sort of took yourself off and carried on doing exactly that, carried on being that person.
Julia, it takes me 20 minutes to write a tweet now, and I always have a spelling mistake, and I end up deleting it, and I end up posting it again. So I have no idea who that person was 10 years ago. But it's true, it was something that was really from the heart. It wasn't from the mind, it was from the heart. And so I feel like I did it. It wasn't really, it was something that I wanted to do. It emanated from love rather than maybe from a political agenda that I had in mind. So yeah, things change, I suppose.
So Christina, I wonder if you can chart the spectrum, if you like, between reporting straight news and actually having that sort of love for a subject that Sultan spoke about, and a care for the people that you're writing about. And so that becomes more agenda-based journalism.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously much of what's put on social media is activism, it isn't journalism, and I also think there's a danger for journalists that sometimes they can spend a lot of time tweeting and actually not really thinking about and having the big picture of what's going on, because it's actually very time consuming. So sometimes I see some of my colleagues every few minutes sending something, you know, when something big is going on, and you think actually, but it's important to kind of sit back for a moment and think about and have a sort of longer view. But I do think, you know, journalists talk about objectivity, but the fact is none of us are really objective, because we all have a particular point of view depending on where we're coming from, and you know, who we quote makes a difference as to how the story or the report is going to influence people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with journalists sort of caring. I think you're a much better journalist, right, if you care about something and, you know, things make you angry and you want people reading about whatever it is you're seeing. I've written a lot in my new book, for example, about sexual violence against women. I want people to be angry about what's happening and to see the injustice and to want to do something about it. So, you know, you could say that I'm not being very objective, maybe, but it's not something that I think you can be very objective about. When you meet women who've gone through these terrible things, that shouldn't be happening in the 21st century, and something should be done about it.
I wonder whether you feel that you've had to earn your stripes in order to have the privilege of being able to you know, choose a story like that to write about and to be listened to. You say in your book that in your acknowledgements you talk about Eleanor Mills, who's the Sunday Times Magazine editor, and how supportive she had been. But at the same time, you've had mostly male editors who haven't necessarily been so supportive of some of the things that you've wanted to write about. Just talk to us a little bit about how those politics within a newsroom work.
Absolutely. I mean, I've never had a female foreign editor. So the person that I speak to has always been a man. And men and women think about things quite differently. And foreign editors I've had are much more interested in what I call the sort of bang bang. And I'm much more interested in the people living in that situation and how you survive and how you protect and feed and educate your children or elder population. And that's almost always the women that are doing that. So so I've always had a sort of argument with editors over what actually I can report on. So it's not just, you know, people talk about now there's more women in the field, which is great and it's true, but that's not enough, because, you know, you can have as many women reporting on these issues as you like, or as many people of certain ethnicity or from a particular region. But if the person who's choosing what actually goes in the paper and where, or what tops a news program, is a sort of middle-class white Englishman, that choice is going to be quite different than it might be if it was somebody of a different sex or a different ethnicity. And I think that is very important. And I have had issues with not being able to get stories about particularly this issue of war, rape and sexual violence, that I've had male editors say to me, you know, nobody wants to read about that. It's and just because something may be uncomfortable to read about, I don't think that we should be ignoring it. That's kind of our job, in my view, that we want people to be aware of injustices and to want to do something about it.
I mean, it's a very important book, your latest book. I mean, as I said, it is harrowing, but it's also compelling. Sultan, and we should also say, excuse me, that the Sunday Times does now have its first female editor in Emma Tucker. Sultan,
actually, not our, it turns out it's our second female editor, that they had a female editor for a short time, like 100 years ago, that no one seems to know much about. So, but yes.
There's the next book. Sultan, let me come to you. Let's talk about the conversations that you might have in terms of when you pitch comments. I mean, how does that go? Do you have to say, this is what I want to talk about? Or does the editor say, right, you know, just come up with 700 words, off you go?
How much freedom do I have to speak here? Well, I just want to add one point about what Christina was saying. I think the stories that are written by women are definitely stories that I'm more interested in reading. I want to know the human story. I'm not interested in the bang bang. I want to learn about the human stories, the sacrifices, the experiences that people go through. And I think these are the stories that resonate. And of course, many male journalists also do that, but you see it come across more maybe with more empathy when a woman writes it. And I very much encourage that there's more and more women editors in our part of the world, as well of newspapers. We've had Mina Al-Uraibi of The National, Aisha Taryam of Gulf Today, and of course the Financial Times has Rula Khalaf, who is I think one of the first sort of Western newspapers to have a Middle Eastern editor. So congratulations to all these women and many others. I'm sure I'm forgetting names, but me pitching comments, it almost is never the case that I'm told or a topic is suggested. I'm interested in a topic, but I was very lucky to have great editors. I mean, I also had women editors, and I think that was very, very helpful for me, because it helps me sort of come out of this sort of male view of the world. And I think it's healthy maybe for a male writer to have a female editor, and maybe vice versa, although I would always root for a woman to be sort of the boss in all circumstances. In any case, the topics I had suggested and I had written about 10 years ago are topics that in most Middle Eastern countries today are probably criminalized. So I wrote about issues that I can get in trouble if I wrote about today, whether it is human rights or democracy or issues of different treatment for different minorities and calling these government out. And, you know, I remember, I'll tell you one story. I remember a few years ago, about 5-6 years ago, I heard news from a friend that the Gulf states were coming out with a statement about how they are not taking in Syrian refugees. So they were going to release a statement together, all the countries. And so, so I decided that if I wanted to write about it and say we shouldn't take this decision, but it's kind of tricky here, Julia. If you write a commentary after the government has made the position clear, then you could be in trouble. But if you write the commentary before the government releases its position, you could always claim ignorance and say, I had no idea that this was happening. And so when I heard that the Gulf states were coming out with this statement that they called aid, not shelter. This is what they called it. We're offering aid, but not shelter. So I couldn't pitch the article to a regular newspaper. They tell me we need 24 hours. So I contacted one of the international online magazines that I was in touch with then. I have no idea if it's still there. It's called IB Times and International Business Times. I'm not even sure if they exist. And I said, listen, I'm going to send you an article on the condition that you publish it within the hour. And so we got it published at 5 p.m. And by 8 p.m., the government came up with their statement. And I had already tweeted it and everyone saw it. And everyone, I mean, I was saved and I had my opinion was out there. But I feel like it's important for you to know how to navigate this minefield. Had I waited a few hours, there was no chance for me to have published this piece.
I want to talk about courage, and I'll come to your courage in a second, Christina. But Sultan, being at home and doing something like that, is it on a par with the sort of thing where Christina goes into a more tricky situation? And I don't mean that to sound crass, but actually there are ramifications for you.
First of all, in terms of bodily injury, is zero sort of, how do I say, comparison. Of course, what brave individuals like Christina Lamb and so many journalists who have either lost their lives or have been injured in the line of duty in a way, these are heroes and heroines, and they are really individuals that I mean, I look up to, even if I wasn't interested in the media. But definitely in many countries, unfortunately in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Africa and Asia, it's not just a regional issue. You see journalists who have spoken up about certain issues around the world, either be targeted, and this is not in war zones. These are in regular countries that are not experiencing conflict. They could be harassed, there are personal ramifications that are threats that could be made against them and against their families. And so, yes, we should definitely take this into consideration, but definitely, I just want to make it very clear. There is no comparison in terms of sort of bodily harm that individuals like Christina and many, many others who have gone into Syria, who've gone to Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, and so many others experience. So courage, as we say, chapeau to people like Christina, and we are really in awe of their courage.
Christina, it does take courage, and you've talked in your book and more generally about how it's become more dangerous for journalists. I wonder how much you think the change in the landscape in terms of Twitter and immediacy and people knowing where you are, is how much that's part of it, or are there other things at play as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I really appreciate Sultan's kind words, but I think that it's much, what we do, we're choosing, right, to go into places and put ourselves in danger, but we fly away at the end of it. And I think it is much more dangerous, living in a place where you're reporting on things in your own country or region where people don't want you to be saying those things. And, we have seen, look at what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, the media climate over the last few years has got a lot worse. A lot more journalists are being killed, but not necessarily being killed doing kind of conflict reporting that I'm doing, but being killed reporting on things in their own countries. And often could be corruption. I mean, you had Daphne Caruana Galicia in Malta being killed in a car bomb. You had the young Slovakian journalist who was reporting on corruption who was killed. The last few years, unfortunately, have been very bad time for press freedom. And of course, it's not helped having a president of the United States who talks about journalists as enemies of the people. We've seen in just, recent weeks in the protests, journalists covering the protests after George Floyd's terrible killing. I think around 400 journalists have been arrested or physically harmed. That's more than would happen normally in 3 or 4 years in the United States, and this happened within 3 weeks. So the kind of example that is being set now from countries that were supposed to be kind of paragons of freedom for the press to the rest of the world is not there. And so it's not just sort of authoritarian countries we're talking about. And we've seen during COVID-19 with China, Iran, various countries trying to stop or censor what can go out from journalists. And also, I mean, Iraq suspended Reuters' license for 3 months because they were questioning the reporting of the official figures for COVID-19. So sadly, we're seeing a lot of people really restricting press freedom. And I think it's actually the last couple of years have been the worst climate for media, probably in the whole time, well, not probably, definitely in the whole time that I've been a reporter.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn the conversation, you mentioned the President of the United States, let's turn the conversation to fake news. And I would like to actually have a couple of polls in quite quick succession. If the audience is keen to become involved in those, that would be lovely. So if we could get the first poll question up, please. Do just give us your opinion and we'll have a look at the results of that and perhaps discuss them. So, how effective are you at identifying fake news? You never get caught, you sometimes get caught out, and you often trust stories that turn out to be fake. I'll give you, 10 seconds to decide. Be honest, please. No one will know what you've said. You never get caught out, you sometimes get caught out, you often trust stories that turn out to be fake.
Julia, how come we can't vote?
You can't, I'm sorry, Sultan, but we'll ask you what your view is. So let's take that one down, and I wonder whether we have some results from that. Okay, sometimes get caught out is the winner there, 63%, 12%. Okay. Does that surprise you, Sultan? And does that chime with your own experience?
Definitely does not surprise me. I'll tell you why. Because fake news has become more and more sophisticated. So I feel like these people who create it, it's an industry, right? The people who are involved in this industry, they now realize that if they write news items that are completely outrageous, that people might not buy it at all. So what they're doing now is sort of writing something true with something untrue, trying to confuse people, wrap a little bit of poison into the sweet so that you sort of consume it completely. And as Christina said, that one of the major proponents of fake news maybe in the world is a person who has, I wrote this down, let me read that, 82 million followers on Twitter. And so if the might of BBC, of its 13 million, and all of us come together, we won't be able to match his single tweet, his single fake news, and the damage that it is causing around the world.
Christina, I wonder, do you follow Donald Trump?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so I was going to say, I was thinking that actually perhaps of those thousands, many people, it's not because they're going to believe it, but it's because you need to be across this information, don't you, as journalists and just as individuals.
Well, yeah, I mean, he makes foreign policy decisions on Twitter. I mean, you wake up in the morning to see this stream of tweets, often in capital letters, which decide what's going to happen somewhere or other. That's how the Afghan peace deal was kind of imploded last summer when he suddenly tweeted that he was had lost patience with it. So yeah, you do have to follow it. The problem is, I'm surprised actually on the poll, 24% said they're never caught out, because it's quite difficult never to be caught out. I've been caught out. I've retweeted things which I thought were credible that turn out to be untrue. because sometimes, you know, things look very convincing, and so I'm much more careful now before I retweet anything. But and you know, some people are very sophisticated at the way they do it, and it's a problem for us because it reduces trust. There already was a problem of trust in media anyway, but when there's a lot of fake news out there, it reduces trust. And it's also, we seem to be in a time where, you know, facts don't matter to some people, and you know, you can say as many times as you want and show a picture of something, or you know, prove something with evidence, and there'll be people that just won't accept it, and that, I think, has really complicated things. We've seen recently with COVID-19, you know, the number of people that believe that it was caused by 5G masts, based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But and even, you know, we in the UK, quite well-known news presenter also retweeted something on that and talked about it as if it was a credible thing. So it does make it difficult for the rest of us, because we argue that when there's so much disinformation out there and misinformation, that it makes our role more important, because it means that you need to rely more on hopefully credible media and people that are actually out there and have been going to the same place for years and have sources, and rather than all of this stuff that comes out in the social media ether.
Well, let's bring in that second poll question, if we may, please, because that relates to that. And let me also, a reminder to everybody that there is a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. If you've got a question for Christina or Sultan, do please pop your question in there, and we'll come to those in a minute. But the next poll question, if we may, please. Do you get your news reports from traditional sources, TV news, newspapers, print and online, or through social media feeds? More traditional or more social? If you've got a 50-50 balance, you're in trouble, but you'll have to choose one or the other, traditional or social. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The poll has now closed. Okay, so 61%. Is that heartening for you, Christina, that 61% of people are still getting their news from traditional sources, or actually you're a bit worried about the remainder?
I don't know. I mean, a few years ago, people said print was going to die completely, and we are still there. So maybe it should be heartening. And I also wonder, you know, what that result would have been a few months ago, because I think actually COVID-19 has seen people turning more back to traditional media. We certainly have far more people reading the Times, the Sunday Times, than we had, or at least our digital products. And in the UK, people have gone back much more to watching BBC and listening to traditional radio rather than getting news off social media. And we have seen, you know, this campaign at the moment with a lot of brands removing their ads from Facebook, saying that Facebook isn't doing enough to remove fake news and also hateful content.
Well, at the risk of people having poll fatigue, I'm going to jump straight in with the third poll, because it relates to exactly what you just said. Whether in a crisis situation, people turn to one or the other. So again, if we may have that third poll, please. We're keeping you busy today. You can't just sit back and watch this. We need to know what you think. Has the COVID-19 crisis seen you turn back to more traditional media for trusted information rather than stories on social media? A straight yes or no, if you would, please. It's interesting, your perspective on that, Christina.
Yeah, I hope people are now going to prove me wrong, probably.
Let's see. No, there we go. We have gone for traditional. So that's almost 80%. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that newsrooms are having to pivot in the same way with all of this, in terms of their thinking about things as well as everybody else. I want to talk about a story that you were involved in, and that you have written about in your book, and that is the Twitter hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, because that story grew worldwide from a single tweet. Tell us about that and the effect of it.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So this is the story of the Chibok girls in Nigeria. You might remember more than 200 girls back in 2014 were kidnapped from their club, or from their dormitory, their school dormitory, in a place called Chibok in northeast Nigeria, taken by Boko Haram fighters into the Sambisa forest. And actually, I had seen something about that on a Wire story and suggested to my foreign editor, who wasn't very interested. But 2 weeks later, this hashtag Bring Back Our Girls suddenly went absolutely viral. And basically what had happened was a Nigerian lawyer had been at a conference, a commercial lawyer, and in Port Harcourt, and was just packing to go home in his hotel room. And there was a conference going on in the hotel that was being streamed onto the TV. And he just had it in the background and heard Obi Ezekwili, the former education minister, talking about this abduction of these girls. And she ended by saying, "Bring back our girls." So he tweeted this as he was leaving for the airport, and somehow it got picked up by a film producer in LA, who then retweeted, who had a big following. And suddenly you had people all over the world like Michelle Obama and Kim Kardashian holding up these Bring Back Our Girls placards and doing selfies. And it became like the #1 story in the world. And we were suddenly all deployed to Nigeria, and there were journalists from absolutely every network from everywhere around the world broadcasting day and night for about 2 weeks about this story. And I think the Nigerian government, which had really done nothing to try and rescue the girls, were completely taken aback, because they were astonished that this had become such an issue. And in fact, I then later went back to, because the problem is the media lose interest very quickly. So for 2 weeks, that was a huge story. And then, nothing more was happening. So people then moved on to something else. And people kind of forgot about the girls. So I went back to try and find out what had happened to them. Went to these camps around Maiduguri in northern Nigeria. And found that there were thousands and thousands of girls that had been abducted, and nobody had written anything about them. And really, the Chibok girls was just the tip of the iceberg, but it was because of this hashtag that they had become such a major global issue. But although initially I thought this was a good thing, that it meant that this brought attention to their issue, later on, I have to say, I wonder whether it was, because the fact they became such an international issue meant that for Boko Haram, they were like the crown jewels. They weren't just going to hand them over, because they saw that everybody thought this was something huge. So they wanted a lot more for those girls. So to this day, 6 years on, more than 100 of those girls are still missing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. I'd like to go to questions now. We've got one coming in here from Aisha. This is one for you, Sultan. How can storytelling or journalism thrive in a heavily censored region? You mentioned earlier that things that you wrote about 10 years ago would not be acceptable now. So I guess suggesting that the freedom of the press has become less than it was. So Aisha's question, how can storytelling or journalism thrive in a heavily censored region?
Much of the world, unfortunately, is now censored in one way or the other. But what I have done, for example, is pivoted to storytelling from the use of politics to the use of culture, art, architecture. And even though it sounds as though it is disconnected, there's been a lot of major political events that took place in the last 50, 60 years in the Middle East that were reflected in artworks. In fact, I teach a class in the US called Politics of Middle Eastern Art. The class, I would say, is 75% politics, 25% art. because if you want to analyze a painting, you have to look at the context in which the artist had made this work, whether it's a painting or a sculpture, who funded it, who bought it, where it's been displayed, who are the characters who are involved in this, who's being depicted, who's not involved, and whether it was censored or not. So yes, people find ways to survive in the most difficult circumstances. We saw this in the siege of Sarajevo, where there was a lot of culture that was thriving, even in the midst of one of the most vicious conflicts in the past 50 years, at least in Europe and even in the world. And so, yes, human beings find ways to sort of express themselves. And if it is not with pen and paper, they find other ways. They write poetry, they create a painting, they might even write in fiction. So I know a friend of mine who has moved his writing to fiction, and this was his way of writing about a region and being critical of how things were being handled in much of this part of the world.
That's an interesting point about fiction, and it's one that you bring out, Christina, in that sometimes fiction is perhaps quicker to or more able to tell the truth. And you point to Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale in terms of Argentina, I believe, her using some of the horrendous things that happened there in that fiction before they ever came out in journalistic terms.
Yes, I mean, you only have to look at, great Russian writers, novelists, you learn much more about the politics of Russia from reading, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and others than you could get from Russian news sources at the time. So I think fiction can be very powerful, though I do get frustrated by where you don't know whether something is actually true or not. So, these kind of non-fiction novels. So I find it personally, I want to know, what actually happened and what didn't. But it is extremely difficult to operate, I think, we're very lucky to live, well, even the UK has quite a lot of media restrictions, people don't always realize, but, relatively much more free. And it's frustrating to me to see so many authoritarian governments around the world really cracking down on the media, and I'm afraid also using coronavirus as an excuse to sort of suppress criticism and lock up people who they find inconvenient.
How have you found that you've been able to continue reporting or otherwise during this crisis?
Well, it's not an ideal time to be a foreign correspondent, has to be said, when you can't travel. And also people, because, this is, for most people, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to them. We're all looking much more inward. And I mean, it was already frustrating, frankly, in the UK the last few years with Brexit has meant that there's become much more focus on what's happening inside the country and less outside. But then COVID-19 on top of that, it's really reduced foreign coverage. And it worries me because, the world hasn't stopped. Wars haven't stopped in Yemen, Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan's been seeing more fighting than it has for most of the 19 years of war. And it's just not getting the coverage. I mean, one of the most shocking, brutal attacks I've ever seen or was the attack on the maternity hospital in Kabul last month, where 16 new mothers or pregnant mothers were killed and newborn babies. I mean, absolutely horrendous. That got so little coverage. I mean, it wasn't on the evening news in the UK. And you just think, if we're not covering things like that, that's just really worrying. And this is a global pandemic. So, you're actually only as strong as the weakest health system in the world. So we may get rid of coronavirus more or less in our own countries. Actually, as I'm sure everybody watching knows, the UK has not, and we have been one of the worst countries. But if your country has managed to reduce, if it's still happening in lots of other countries in Latin America or in Africa or in South Asia, and then people fly in from those countries, then you've got it again. So as long as we don't have any vaccine, we actually all, I believe, have an interest in trying to help the health systems of countries all around the world to try and combat this.
Sultan, there's a question come in here which sort of brings in the business side of things. So Saida is asking, to what extent do media ownership patterns affect the agency of journalists, especially in countries where there are close state-business relations?
Yes, so this is something that is not just particular to the Middle East. In the Middle East, many of the newspapers and news organizations are owned by the state. This applies to right-wing and left-wing so-called newspapers. And if they're not owned by the state, they're owned by individuals who are close to the state, businessmen who expect, or at least who have some kind of relationship with the government. This is also the case in the West. If you think of Washington Post being owned by Jeff Bezos, somebody who is, yes, he is a free, I mean, he's an entrepreneur, but also he is someone who sort of owns a newspaper. And how does that impact the news that you can publish? If you think of, I mean, this is a contentious issue, but Facebook being a platform to publish news, is Facebook a news organization? They think not, but some people apparently think that they are. And so where's Mark Zuckerberg from this? And he started sort of taking a stance in the past few weeks, and in the eyes of the US government, it was far too much, but in the eyes of US corporations, it was far too little. And so yes, there is a relationship here, and there are ramifications between the ownership of the newspaper and what subjects get covered and how much censorship there is. And I think, I mean, definitely what we need is a future where news organizations exist with endowments, where they are free, where there's a board rather than an individual or even a government that is sort of the overall seer. I think that you're looking, or we should be looking at an entity that is owned either collectively with all its issues and problems. We have an example in Wikipedia. Yes, there are a lot of issues there, but it is sort of a collective effort rather than a single individual who can pull the plug. And we have seen this happen with US news sites in the past few years and other parts of the world. It's a difficult, it really is a difficult question to answer.
It's a difficult question for you to answer as well, Christina. I wonder what Rupert Murdoch would think about what Sultan's just said.
I was hoping I was going to get off that. Yes, well, obviously I work for a newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch. I think that, I mean, one important thing to say, I mean, in an ideal world, newspapers and media organizations would be owned by or run by philanthropic foundations, as Sultan was talking about. But the fact is, it is a business, and it's also expensive to do news, particularly foreign news. And we've talked about the sort of decreasing space for press freedom and the difficulties for traditional media. But of course, one of the biggest challenges in recent years has been the economic challenge, because all of the fact that people can access news for free digitally, even if we may not like some of that news, does mean that people are not buying newspapers or using traditional media in the same way that they used to, and sales have gone down enormously, and also advertising has gone down enormously. So it's difficult for papers to operate in the way that they used to. So Sunday Times, for example, used to have 10 foreign pages. We regularly now only have 2. And we have massively reduced our foreign staff, which I think is extremely sad. But that is really a reflection of the economic climate. So the fact is that somebody like Rupert Murdoch is a businessman, but he is still investing in media. You know, I've never ever been told what to write about something. for his paper. And so I think it's good that he still invests in it. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question here for Sultan. It's from Sarah. Why do you think there's a huge difference in, where's it gone? Sorry, here we go. Why do you think there's a huge difference in the type of stories published and pursued between Arabic and English news stories within the same region? There's a sort of embedded certainty in there, which you may want to disagree with, but I wonder whether you might bring in your own experience, because you wrote in an English newspaper in Gulf News a few years ago a comment piece about the potential for long-term expats to possibly move towards citizenship. And one of the criticisms that came out of that was that you wrote it in an English newspaper rather than an Arabic newspaper, and therefore were talking to a different audience.
That is completely true and completely understandable. So I should not be dismissing these concerns. I think I underestimated how contentious this effort or this commentary might have been then. This is an article that's 7 or 8 years old now, and I stand by every word. I haven't changed my mind, but I understand people saying, hey, how come you didn't bring this to us to discuss? But in reality, the fact that it was written in English, it sparked a conversation, much like that Twitter hashtag sparked the conversation. And so the Arabic newspapers picked it up, and I remember one person wrote a commentary saying, this is a foreign-backed call, and someone read the suspicious call by an individual to grant these such rights or citizenship rights to foreigners. And what was interesting was that they continued to mistranslate. The article took on a life of its own, and it sort of morphed into something completely different. I had never written about citizenship. I had never written about mass citizenship. I said selectively we should think about it. I said we should think about thinking about it. But it sort of took a life of its own. And I'm really glad that took place. But I must admit that it's important that we have conversations in our local languages in Arabic. I think that takes a priority and a precedent over the English language. And I started as much as possible writing in both Arabic and English. It takes a lot of time, Julia, to do that. I'm not particularly intelligent and smart when it comes to translating everything I do into Arabic, only because I haven't got the time to do that. But I agree, these individuals, they had a point in saying, why wasn't this raised in our own local language? I would have done it in both languages had I gone back in time.
And do you find that you also tweet different things in Arabic and in English?
I mostly, I think I had like 50,000 tweets, and I think 49,500 of them are in English, and a very few of them are in Arabic. So my Twitter feed is an English language feed. I don't try to hide. I'll give you an example quick. I once wrote a commentary in English, and I said that there is this political Islamic group called the Muslim Brotherhood, and I called it a populist group. And then in the Arabic newspaper, when they translated, they said Sultan called them popular. And I said, no, there's a slight difference. So if you don't do the translation yourself, someone might mistranslate it.
Fair enough. Christina, we're almost out of time, but there's a lovely question here, which is sort of journalism related and sort of just lovely. It's from Julie, who says, are you still in contact with Malala? And I wonder whether I might add Najeen into that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, one of the great joys, I mean, people often say to me, how can you do what you do? Because you go to like the worst places in the world and see people doing terrible things. And I always say, but actually in those places, you see the most amazing people as well. You know, like maybe you need to see the darkest sky to see the brightest star. And it's been a great joy and privilege for me that I've been able to work with both Malala, the girl who was shot by the Taliban and now campaigns for, had campaigned before for education for children, but now globally. And also Malala, also Najeen, who is this most amazing Syrian refugee who has cerebral palsy, had never been to school, couldn't walk, and managed to get all the way to Germany from Aleppo, pushed by her sister Nasreen, and now living in Germany and going to school. And both of them are real inspirations to me. And actually, apart from both of them having remarkable stories and campaigns, they are both really, really funny people and people that you feel better about life when you spend time with. And Malala has just finished at Oxford, and sadly, I mean, I actually feel that COVID-19, the group that are most affected by this are young people and students who are just finishing university that had to go home and not be able to have the usual, like, last term of doing exams and celebration afterwards, and also have no idea now if there'll be any jobs or internships or anything like that. So Malala, like many students, had to go back home and do her final few months of university from home, do her exams online. So she's now finished, and her family, her two younger brothers who tease her a lot, both sprayed all sorts of things all over her to make it look like she had just finished at Oxford. And yeah, so and I'm really excited to see what she is going to do next, and also Eugene too, who is at school but due to finish.
Two very resilient young people, and it's lovely to end on that note, because that is just about all that we have time for. So let me say, Sultan and Christina, this has been absolutely fascinating, really wonderful. My privilege to be able to speak to you both in this way, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everybody for watching, for tuning in. There's more to come in this series, so do please keep doing that. I'd like now, though, to introduce, as if she needs an introduction, Isabel Abelhoul, who's the Chief Executive of the Emirates Literature Foundation, to say a final few words, if you would, Isabel.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Wow, wow, and wow. 3 wows. What amazing conversations you have had together. And we could have gone on for hours and hours. You are both, as well as being commentators, journalists, you are both great storytellers, and you had us captivated through the whole hour. Julia, as always, you do a fantastic job, and a huge thank you to His Excellency Zaki Nusseibeh, the Minister of State, and the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy, who've sort of enabled this wonderful conversations across borders. Huge thank you to all of you. I know we're going to have our after party privately on Zoom in a minute, but please tune in Saturday, the 11th of July, because just before the UAE launches the Hope probe to Mars, we will be joined by His Excellency Zaki Nusseibeh, Dr. Farouk Albaz from America, and not at mission control, but very near to it, Salim Al-Mari, who is the head of the astronaut program, will be there live, and we will have 3 or 4 days before the actual launch happens. So it is really looking at the aspirations, the history of why a country like the UAE is so ambitious in its effort to reach Mars. So what could be more wonderful? Everyone out there, thank you so much in your thousands for allowing us into your homes this evening. It's been such a pleasure, and I just can't tell you how much we have enjoyed these weekly conversations. Stay well, take care everyone, and goodbye from me.